and death of Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. My esteemed colleague, Dr. Gory Stearns, told you about the mystery surrounding Poe's death, and this is appropriate, for as literary critic Philip Van Dorn Stern notes, death was Poe's favorite subject, the idea he was most obsessed with, so that nearly all his work consists of variations on this single theme. Poe, as we all know, is famous for his horror stories on death. However, in honor of Poe tonight, I want to suggest to you that it is not death which is the true terror for Poe. A recurring motif in Poe's literature is a premature burial. Professor Maggie Black mentioned this in her speech. Characters are either buried alive or think they are buried alive in no less than 4 of his short stories. And I want to examine this motif of a premature burial. For Poe, this is a liminal state. It's an in-between state where one is not quite fully alive, but not quite dead either. As Poe states, in such a state, the boundaries which divide life from death are at best shadowy and vague. Who shall say where the one ends and the other begins? And I think by exploring his use of this theme, we can discover what his philosophical attitudes toward life and death and the connection between them might be. And I want to argue that for Poe, the terror is not death, but a poorly lived life in the face of death. Poe's short story, A Premature Burial, opens up with a narrator who tells us of this medical condition that he suffers from, which he describes in the following way. In mild cases, the patient lies for a day only, or even a shorter period, in a species of exaggerated lethargy. He is senseless and externally motionless, but the pulsation of his heart is still faintly perceptible. In more extreme cases, the most rigorous medical tests fail to establish any material distinction between the state of the sufferer and what we conceive of as absolute death. And the narrator who suffers from this condition fears that this medical condition he has will result in a premature burial. This fear that he has of being buried alive slowly culminates throughout the short story. He writes, "I was lost in the reveries of death, and the idea of a premature burial held continual possession of my brain." And the narrator's thoughts, he can't even stop thinking about this in his sleep. He has dreams of a Grim Reaper-like character who takes him to the graves of all mankind, opens up the graves, and shows him that the real slumbers, the real sleepers, that is, those who are truly dead, are fewer by many millions than those who slumbered not at all, than those who were buried alive. And so this fear that he has begins to culminate such that he takes excessive precautions to avoid this fate. He makes for himself a safety coffin, which is a coffin that consists of a bell that will be above the ground with a rope attached to it, and the rope goes down into the coffin and is attached to the apparently deceased finger so that if he resurrects, he can ring the bell and alarm the living above. So he builds this coffin for himself. He refuses to leave the company of his friends who know about this condition for fear that somebody might find him in a coma and bury him alive. He also begins to doubt the care and fidelity of his friends. After all, he's been hanging around with them for a long time now, and he thinks that they might be getting sick of him. He writes, "I even went so far as to fear that, as I occasioned much trouble, my friends might be glad to consider any protracted attack a sufficient excuse for getting rid of me altogether." So he has this fear, and the short story ends with a moment of awakening. Suddenly he finds himself emerging from unconsciousness. He opens his eyes to total darkness, and he realizes he has been buried alive. He reaches for the bell rope, but it's not to be found. All his precautions were for naught. He screams out in terror, only to be hushed by 3 companions. Then he suddenly realizes he's not in a coffin after all. He had accompanied friends on a gunning expedition the night before, down the James River. He is not in a coffin, but only in the berth of a boat. This moment for him is not just a literal awakening from unconsciousness, it's also a metaphorical awakening. He realizes that his life has been ruined by this fear of death and this fear of being buried alive. He writes that the torture, that is, his thoughts of being buried alive, they were inconceivably hideous. But out of evil proceeded good. For their very excess wrought in my spirit an inevitable revulsion. My soul acquired tone, acquired temper. I went abroad, I took vigorous exercise, I breathed the free air of heaven, and I thought upon other subjects than death. This moment for him was a life-changing experience. He realizes his fear of death had been ruining his life, and he also comes to discover that his condition was not the cause of his fear, but the consequence. For as soon as he conquers this fear of being buried alive, his medical condition subsides. So what can we learn about Poe and his attitude toward life and death and the connection between the two in this story? On the assumption that Poe had a philosophy of death that can be gleaned from this story, I want to compare him to other major philosophical views on what our attitudes toward death should be and why. And I want to begin with Plato. Plato's character Socrates famously argues that the fear of death is only to think ourselves wise without really being wise. For it is to think that we know what we do not know. For no one knows whether death may not be the greatest good that can happen to a man, but men fear it as if they know quite well that it was the greatest of evils. In later works, Socrates even argues for the immortality of the soul, and that it will be rewarded in the afterlife based on its virtuous character in this life. But for Poe, he offers us no such hope. Nowhere in his stories are we led to believe that life after death is any more than a deeper state of unconsciousness than the condition from which his narrator suffers. And so Poe cannot accept Plato's rationale. Now, Poe does share some similarities with another ancient philosophical tradition, Stoicism. The Stoics, one of the Stoics, Seneca, wrote that there is no greater misfortune that can befall you than to be stricken from the roster of the living while you are still living. Notice that death is not the terror, but living like the dead is the terror. And according to Stoicism, the therapy which they suggest to deal with this fear, I do not think Poe would agree with. They claim that in some mysterious way, the actual course of our lives are directed by something they call the logos, the cosmic mind. And they were fatalists, and they believed that part of this fate was our own death. The Stoics believe that peace of mind comes to the individual whose will is in accord with this cosmic mind. As the Stoic philosopher Epictetus tells us, we are all just actors in a drama, such as the playwright wishes it to be. If he wants it to be short, it will be short. If long, long. If he wants you to be a beggar, play that capably, or a lame man, or a ruler, or a private person. Your job is to play the role well. But ultimately, Poe does not accept this rationale. As Epictetus says, don't seek for things to happen as you wish, but wish for things to happen as they do. Stoicism is a philosophy of acceptance, but we don't find the narrator accepting death. Instead, he opts for diversion. He opts to breathe the free air of heaven and to travel abroad. I want to argue finally that Poe is closest to the Epicureans, another ancient philosophical tradition on death. The Epicureans disagreed with the Stoics. They thought the universe was not organized by a divine principle. Instead, everything was just cosmic chance. In addition to this, they argued that pleasure was the only thing that was good in life, and we want to increase pleasure and minimize pain. They were hedonists, but contrary to the modern notion, this doesn't mean a life of decadence. It just means simple pleasures, conversation with friends, and a good but simple diet. Epicurus writes that the right understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable, not because it adds to an infinite span of time, but because it takes away the craving for immortality. For Epicurus, since death is the cessation of pain and pleasure, it is literally neither good nor bad, and if we understand that, that alleviates the fear of death. Epicurus again states, for there is nothing terrible in life for the man who has truly comprehended there is nothing terrible in not living. And this is similar to Poe's narrator. Poe's narrator decides to opt for the simple pleasures. He opts to travel abroad, to exercise, and to breathe the free air of heaven. Okay, time to test our memory. May I have the house lights, please? Okay, so my question is, when Poe's narrator thought he was buried alive, where was he actually? And I see Robert's hand.
In a boat.
You're not supposed to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We're allowed. No, it's the
Go
host.
ahead.
Way to go, Jordan.
Are we counting it?
Go.
Yeah, I think
We're counting it.
we are good.
My apologies. Maybe we'll share the credit.
He has the crown.
So while Poe would have us opt for the simple pleasures of life and not to think much about death, let us continue to meditate on life and death and the connection between the two with a reading from the Bells.